Marissa Lake had moved to Sycamore Glen not for the quiet, but for the illusion of it. The neighborhood, with its symmetrical hedges and manicured driveways, sold itself as a retreat from the chaos of the city, a place where everything was tidy, predictable, and safe. She had spent years consulting on botanical restorations for museums and estates, so the house she chose reflected that same obsession with order. The small brick home sat at the end of a curved street, shaded by maple trees that bled amber light in the evenings. It was perfect, or at least it seemed to be. What she hadn't expected was that the most meticulously planned community she had ever seen was also one of the most quietly unhinged. From her first week there, Marissa could feel it. The way people waved too eagerly, smiled a second too long, and then whispered behind clipped fences. And always, at the center of that circle of social gravity, stood Karen Melrose. Karen was everything the neighborhood pretended to be: elegant, well-connected, and utterly unapproachable. Her house was the largest on the street, a modern white facade with glass balconies and a koi pond that seemed to hum with unnatural perfection. She had been there for over a decade and chaired nearly every committee: landscaping, community relations, beautification. Her influence wasn't official, but it didn't need to be. If you wanted something done in Sycamore Glen, you called Karen first. When Marissa met her on the second morning after moving in, Karen arrived uninvited, carrying a basket of lemons from her yard and a disarming smile that felt rehearsed. She toured Marissa's garden as though she owned it, complimenting the arrangement of native plants, but frowning slightly at the wild mint creeping near the fence. "You'll want to trim that back," she said softly. "It tends to cross property lines when you're not looking." It was meant as advice, but the subtext was unmistakable. At first, Marissa brushed it off. People like Karen existed everywhere, women who built empires out of social control. She had dealt with them before. Yet there was something different about this place, something that made her feel watched even when she wasn't. When she unpacked the last of her boxes, she discovered a narrow strip of land behind the cedar hedge that looked wrong. The fence was crooked, slanted inward by a few feet. According to her deed, the property should have extended farther. She dug into the soil out of curiosity and hit metal, a small boundary marker, stamped with county initials, half buried and rusted. It confirmed her suspicion. The fence wasn't where it was supposed to be. Someone had moved it, not by accident, but deliberately. She made a note to address it later, not realizing that later would become the word that doomed her. As summer deepened, the days took on a strange rhythm. Karen was always outside at the same time, pruning, watering, supervising deliveries. She spoke in the tone of someone used to being obeyed, never raising her voice but leaving no room for argument. Every conversation circled back to her favorite subject: the neighborhood's shared aesthetics. She spoke about fences and sightlines as if they were matters of moral importance. Marissa found it both absurd and fascinating, the way the woman could make lawn height sound like a sermon. Still, she kept her distance. Her work often required travel, and she valued solitude more than camaraderie. It was only in quiet moments, late at night when she watered the garden under the porch light, that she noticed the subtle signs of intrusion: a rake leaning in a different spot, soil freshly disturbed near the hedge, the faint scent of chlorine drifting from nowhere. Then one evening, as the light faded into gold, Karen appeared again, standing at the boundary with her usual composure, hands folded neatly before her. "Do you know," she began conversationally, "when my family first looked at this property line, there was a mistake in the survey? It happens more often than you'd think. The fence was never meant to be there." Her voice was calm, too calm, like someone stating a fact already accepted by the world. Marissa tilted her head, unsure if it was a story, a warning, or a test. Karen smiled, a thin, deliberate curve of satisfaction. "But we never made an issue of it. Good neighbors don't." That night, as crickets filled the dark and sprinklers clicked across the lawns, Marissa stood by the window and stared at the faint glow of Karen's backyard lights. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a shadow bending near the fence, something metallic catching the light. She told herself it was nothing, just the reflection of the garden lamp. Yet a thought settled in her mind with the quiet weight of truth. In Sycamore Glen, nothing ever moved by accident. The first real fracture appeared on a Wednesday morning, humid and slow, when the sound of machinery cracked through the calm like thunder. Marissa was in her kitchen, standing barefoot on the cool tile floor, sipping coffee and cataloging a shipment of seeds for work, when the first tremor rattled her windows. It wasn't the sound of a passing truck or routine landscaping. This was heavier, angrier, a rhythmic grinding that set her teeth on edge. She stepped out onto the porch, the mug still in her hand, and froze. An excavator, bright yellow and caked in dust, had parked itself half on Karen Melrose's property and half on her own. Two men in neon vests were guiding the mechanical arm as it tore into the soil. The noise was almost unbearable. Dirt flew in plumes across the hedge, scattering clods onto Marissa's carefully tended flower beds. She stood there for several seconds, not understanding what she was seeing. Then she saw Karen, standing on the patio in a wide straw hat and sunglasses, holding a clipboard, directing the workers as if she were running a municipal project. Marissa crossed the lawn quickly, calling out over the roar of the engine. "Excuse me, what's happening here?" Her voice was swallowed by the machinery, until one of the men noticed her and shut it down with a hiss of hydraulics. Karen turned slowly, that same unfazed smile painted on her face, as though she had been expecting this moment. "Oh, good morning, Marissa. I was going to come by later to explain," she said cheerfully, as if nothing were amiss. "I'm finally getting that pool installed. Can you believe the wait times these days?" Marissa's eyes darted to the open pit that had already devoured part of her garden border. "Your pool?" she asked, the words catching somewhere between disbelief and anger. "This is my property line, Karen. That hole is on my side." Karen's expression softened with mock sympathy, as if she were speaking to a child who had misunderstood her homework. "Oh, sweetheart, that's the old boundary. The previous owner and I had a verbal understanding years ago. The fence was never properly adjusted, and the original survey had discrepancies. This is all being corrected now." Marissa blinked, heat rising behind her ribs. A verbal understanding? That's not legal. You can't just dig into my yard because of something someone supposedly said years ago. The workers exchanged glances, uncertain whether to continue. Karen sighed as though burdened by the petty frustrations of others. "If you have concerns, you can take it up with the homeowners association. They're aware of the project." The casual authority in her tone made Marissa hesitate, not out of doubt, but out of sheer astonishment at the confidence of the lie. She opened her mouth to argue, but the engine roared back to life before she could speak. The machine clawed deeper, tearing through the hedge like it was paper. Marissa stepped back, dirt pelting her shoes. For a moment she could only watch as the structure of her garden collapsed. The tulips she had planted in neat rows were buried, the irrigation line split, water spraying into the churned soil. Karen, unbothered, adjusted her sunglasses and called out to the foreman to keep to schedule. When the noise finally died down an hour later, Marissa found herself standing beside a gaping wound in the earth that stretched several feet into what had been her side of the property. She felt strangely detached, as though watching someone else's life unravel. Karen approached again, her perfume sweet and sharp under the smell of diesel. "You'll love how it looks once it's finished," she said brightly. "I'm going for something very modern. Black stone, vanishing edge, subtle lighting. It'll raise the whole neighborhood's value." Marissa stared at her, unable to form words. Karen's tone was so casual, so certain, that it twisted the situation into something almost surreal. Before Marissa could answer, Karen placed a hand on her arm, the gesture both intimate and intrusive. "You know, it's really better this way. That strip of land wasn't doing you any good. and this will make things even between us. Don't worry, I'll make sure the view from your kitchen stays pleasant." Then she turned and walked back to the workers, her heels sinking slightly into the dirt. That night, Marissa couldn't sleep. She replayed the scene over and over in her mind, the mechanical violence of the excavation mixing with Karen's calm, practiced charm. Every part of it screamed ownership, not discussion. She searched online for the HOA's contact information, combing through outdated pages and PDFs until she found a phone number. The man who answered introduced himself as the project liaison and spoke with rehearsed politeness. When she explained the situation, he paused for an uncomfortably long time before responding. "According to our records, Mrs. Melrose's pool installation was reviewed and approved under temporary variance guidelines," he said. "Any property concerns should be handled through civil mediation." Marissa felt her pulse spike. "But how can they approve something that crosses into my land?" The man coughed lightly, as though the question itself were naive. "The variance application included a statement of mutual understanding between neighbors. It was signed by the previous owner of your home." Marissa sat in silence, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles whitened. She had never met the previous owner, an older couple who had moved out months before she bought the place. If they had signed something informal, it wouldn't hold legal weight, but it would be enough for the HOA to pretend their hands were clean. She ended the call without another word, her stomach churning. Outside, under the streetlights, the excavator still loomed at the edge of the property like a monument to intrusion. The smell of wet earth filled the night air. Somewhere beyond the hedge, she could hear Karen laughing with the workers, her voice clear and melodic, cutting through the darkness like a blade. By morning, the hole had deepened, and the first rebar framework was already in place. Marissa tried once more to reason with Karen, who listened with an expression of patient boredom. "You're making this into something it's not," she said. "The legal side of things is already taken care of. Don't embarrass yourself fighting over a few feet of dirt." When Marissa demanded the paperwork, Karen only smiled and said she'd have her contractor forward it. The contractor, of course, never did. Instead, later that week, Marissa received a notice from the HOA, an almost farcical inversion of reality, stating that she had been reported for harassment of a construction project duly authorized by community standards. It warned that further interference could result in fines. She read the letter twice, then laughed, the sound brittle and empty. Somewhere in her chest, a new feeling began to take shape, something colder and more enduring than anger. That evening she walked along the perimeter, tracing the faint line where her property should have ended, feeling the subtle incline of the land beneath her shoes. The pool excavation glistened under work lights, a pit of glimmering mud and steel. Karen stood nearby, discussing finishes with a contractor, her laughter floating over the fence. Marissa lingered long enough for Karen to notice her. Their eyes met across the ruin of what had once been her garden. Karen's expression was unreadable, almost serene, as if she had already won a battle that hadn't yet begun. Marissa turned away, her jaw set. For the first time since moving to Sycamore Glen, she realized something that would change everything. It wasn't the HOA, the fence, or the pool that threatened her. It was the kind of certainty that lived behind Karen Melrose's smile, the unshakable conviction that whatever she touched was hers. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of noise and intrusion. From sunrise until the last trace of evening light, Marissa listened to the pounding of drills, the clatter of pipes, the shrieks of metal against stone. Dust settled like ash across her porch and garden, coating the leaves of her plants in a fine gray film. Every morning she woke up to new damage, crushed flower beds, displaced soil, footprints stamped into the once manicured paths. The workers no longer even pretended to respect the boundary line. They dragged cords and hoses across her lawn, set their tools on her porch steps, and laughed when she asked them to stop. When she confronted the foreman, a lean man with a permanent sunburn and a smirk that came too easily, he shrugged and told her to talk to Mrs. Melrose. The tone made it clear he knew exactly what that meant. No one questioned Karen, not here. Marissa started documenting everything, not out of obsession, but as self-defense. Each photograph felt like a small assertion of reality, proof that she wasn't losing her mind, proof that her space still had meaning. Karen, of course, seemed to thrive amid the chaos. She visited the site daily, greeting the workers with coffee and homemade muffins, smiling like a benevolent queen overseeing her kingdom's latest improvement. When Marissa passed by, Karen would wave cheerfully, her tone dripping with false warmth. "We're almost there, dear. Once the decking's installed, it'll look seamless. You'll hardly notice it's there." The words had the flavor of a veiled threat. Marissa stopped responding. She avoided eye contact and focused on gathering evidence. Copies of deeds, aerial images from county archives, and her own survey arranged through a private firm. The results confirmed what she already knew. The pool extended 2.4 meters into her property, and the construction violated multiple setback requirements. The report was precise, impartial, and devastatingly clear. She felt a flicker of vindication, but it was short-lived. The HOA dismissed her complaint within 48 hours, citing existing neighborly agreements predating her ownership. The letter, printed on thick paper with embossed headers, reeked of bureaucratic finality. At the bottom was Karen's signature, not as a respondent, but as the landscape committee representative. She had signed the rejection of Marissa's claim herself. It was the kind of arrogance that didn't even attempt subtlety. When Marissa brought this up to the HOA office, the secretary, a tired woman who spoke in hushed tones, simply said, "Mrs. Melrose has a lot of influence here. Maybe try to find a compromise." Compromise. The word tasted bitter. What compromise existed when someone dug into your land and called it improvement? By then, the pool's shape had begun to emerge from the ground, a gray skeleton of rebar and concrete edging that sliced through her garden like an open wound. At night, when the workers were gone, the floodlights stayed on, casting harsh white glare through her bedroom windows. Marissa started keeping the curtains drawn, but even that didn't block the sound of running pumps and the echoing clang of unfinished construction. Sleep became a luxury. She caught herself drifting through days in a haze of exhaustion, her nerves frayed, her patience gone. Friends she called from the city listened politely, but didn't quite grasp the madness of it all. "Just sue her," they said. "Get a lawyer." But they didn't understand that here, in Sycamore Glen, logic wasn't the currency. Reputation was. Karen had spent years weaving herself into every decision, every social event, every council note. Fighting her wasn't just a legal act. It was a declaration of war in a place that thrived on appearances. Still, war was exactly what Marissa was preparing for. The turning point came one evening when she returned from a brief trip to the city and found the workers using her outdoor faucet to mix concrete. A trail of wet footprints led from her porch to the pit. Her garden hose was gone. When she confronted the men, one of them, young, impatient, with the easy cruelty of someone used to impunity, told her to relax. Something inside her broke. She cut the power to the faucet, locked her gate, and called the police. The officer who arrived an hour later listened politely, nodded through her explanation, and then shrugged. "Looks like a civil dispute," he said. "You'll need to take this up with your HOA or file in court." His tone was sympathetic but detached. He left with a faint smell of cologne and the sense that this, too, would be forgotten. When Marissa turned back toward the pit, she saw Karen watching from her patio, a glass of white wine in hand. The woman raised it slightly, like a toast. The gesture was so brazen, so deliberate, that Marissa felt an almost physical chill run through her. The following morning, she found her mailbox stuffed with anonymous flyers announcing a community safety meeting hosted by Karen Melrose to discuss the recent hostility disrupting neighborhood harmony. She didn't have to attend to know what would be said. Later that evening, she caught glimpses of her neighbors gathering across the street. Men in pastel shirts, women in linen dresses, all nodding solemnly as Karen spoke with performative sadness. She didn't need to hear the words. She knew them by heart. The whispers would start tomorrow. Marissa was difficult, unstable, overreacting. The woman who couldn't adjust. It was a pattern as old as the suburb itself. That night the air was thick with humidity, the kind that made sleep impossible. Around midnight, a sound pulled her to the window, a soft, rhythmic thudding. At first she thought it was the construction equipment left on idle, but when she peered through the curtains, she froze. Someone was walking along the edge of the pit with a flashlight, the beam slicing across her garden. The light paused near her hedge, then drifted back to the deeper part of the hole. For several seconds she couldn't move. The figure straightened, turned slightly, and for a brief moment the beam illuminated the face. It was Karen. Calm, unhurried, she examined the rebar frame like a curator admiring her latest exhibit, then descended carefully down the unfinished slope into the pit itself. Marissa watched, her pulse hammering in her ears. She wanted to open the door, to shout, to demand what Karen was doing, but something in the woman's movement stopped her. Karen wasn't sneaking. She was surveying, claiming. By the time dawn came, Marissa had made up her mind. If the HOA refused to act and the police wouldn't intervene, she would take her evidence elsewhere. She contacted a property attorney recommended by a colleague, a quiet man who spoke little, and asked for every document she had. When he reviewed the materials, he frowned. "She's built over your legal boundary. That's indisputable," he said. "But this community, it's complicated. You're not just fighting her. You're fighting the system that enables her." Marissa nodded. "Then we start there." It was the first time in weeks she felt something close to clarity. Outside, the pool shimmered under the morning sun, half-finished but already invasive, a monument to the kind of certainty that ignored everyone else's existence. She didn't yet know how long the fight would take, or what it would cost her, but one truth had finally settled like stone. Karen Melrose had taken something that didn't belong to her, and Marissa intended to take it back. The first letter from the county arrived 2 weeks after Marissa's attorney filed the complaint. It was brief and dry, a formal acknowledgement that her dispute had been registered, followed by a polite reminder that civil property cases could take several months to process. Beneath the bureaucratic language, though, Marissa sensed something almost deliberate in the phrasing, "Do not expect resolution anytime soon." Still, the act of filing had given her momentum. The attorney, a man named Elias Crow, had been in the business long enough to recognize the patterns of neighborhoods like Sycamore Glen, where power wasn't written in contracts, but traded in favors. He warned her that Karen would use every connection she had to stall, confuse, and intimidate. Marissa believed him. She could already see the subtle shifts happening around her. Neighbors who once greeted her with polite smiles now crossed the street. Her landscaper suddenly stopped returning calls, and the HOA newsletter that arrived in her mailbox carried an article about respecting legacy property lines. It didn't mention names, but it didn't need to. Karen had turned the community into an audience. She moved through it with effortless grace, weaving her narrative into backyard conversations and book club meetings. By the time the HOA scheduled a voluntary mediation session, the outcome already felt predetermined. Still, Marissa went, because Elias insisted that showing up mattered more than winning. The meeting took place in the HOA clubhouse, a sterile building that smelled faintly of lemon polish and stale air conditioning. A rectangular table dominated the room, and at its head sat the mediator, a thin man with watery eyes and the weary patience of someone who'd seen too many of these suburban battles. Karen was already there when Marissa arrived, perfectly composed in a cream blouse and pearl earrings, a stack of neatly bound documents before her. "I'm so glad you came," she said warmly, as though this were a social visit. "I think we can clear up this misunderstanding." Marissa didn't respond. Elias placed the property survey on the table, spreading the maps like a declaration. The mediator asked both sides to summarize their positions. Karen spoke first, her tone calm, her gestures practiced. She described the boundary issue as a clerical discrepancy, a trivial matter that had been resolved amicably with the previous owners. She mentioned that her late husband had helped draft the original neighborhood zoning plan, that she had trusted the layout for years. She even smiled as she said it, the picture of sincerity. When it was Marissa's turn, she stayed composed, walking the mediator through each piece of evidence: the deed, the survey, the photographs, the emails from the HOA. Elias added references to the building code violations, his voice steady but firm. The mediator listened, nodding, his gaze flicking between them like a metronome. Then Karen leaned forward, resting her elbows lightly on the table. "You have to understand," she said, her voice soft but sharp around the edges. "The boundaries in this neighborhood have always been flexible. The community has functioned for years on good faith. No one here measures property in inches. We measure it in trust. That's what makes Sycamore Glen special." The mediator hesitated, clearly swayed by the sentimental appeal. Elias, however, didn't flinch. "Good faith," he said quietly, "doesn't justify encroachment." Karen's smile tightened. "Encroachment is such a harsh word. I'd call it an adjustment." The room fell into a silence heavy enough to feel physical. Marissa studied Karen's face, the faint muscle twitch near her jaw, the slight tension in her shoulders. Beneath the charm, there was calculation. This wasn't about land, it was about control. The mediator eventually ended the session with the predictable advice: both parties should work toward mutual understanding. As Marissa gathered her papers, Karen rose, smoothing her blouse, and said with that effortless warmth that always felt like a threat, "You know, I really hope we can move past this, Marissa. You have such a lovely home. It would be a shame to spoil the atmosphere with hostility." Elias touched Marissa's arm before she could reply. "Don't," he murmured under his breath. "She wants a reaction." Outside, the afternoon was heavy with heat. Marissa sat in her car for several minutes before turning the key, watching through the windshield as Karen walked across the parking lot, chatting easily with the mediator. For a moment, it struck Marissa how invincible she looked, her stride confident, her posture impeccable, her voice bright with charm. It wasn't arrogance, it was mastery. Karen understood the unspoken laws of these places better than anyone. Appearances were power, and perception was truth. Marissa realized then that evidence alone wouldn't win. She needed something larger, something that couldn't be dismissed as a private feud. That night, while organizing the mountain of paperwork that had accumulated since the dispute began, Marissa came across the file from the local archives that she'd requested weeks earlier, an old landscaping plan commissioned decades ago, before the HOA even existed. She had ordered it out of curiosity, but now, scanning the faded blueprint, something caught her attention. The plan marked a narrow strip of her property, right along the contested boundary, with a shaded symbol, and the note, "Protected Soil Zone, Fungal Growth Study, 1984. The words seemed almost meaningless until she searched the reference number online and discovered that the site had once been part of a regional ecological survey. According to county records, it was still classified as a restricted disturbance area due to the presence of rare subterranean fungi that contributed to soil regeneration. The designation had likely been forgotten over the years, but it remained technically valid. If Karen's pool foundation touched that zone, and it did, then her project wasn't just a civil trespass. It was an environmental violation. Marissa felt a surge of something that wasn't quite triumph, but close. She called Elias the next morning, her voice steady for the first time in weeks. "There's another angle," she said. "Not property law, environmental law." He asked for details, and as she explained, she could almost hear his mind recalibrating. "That changes everything," he said when she finished. "If we can verify this, the county can impose a halt on construction independent of civil court. She can't override that." Within hours, he had arranged for an environmental assessor to visit the site, under the pretext of verifying soil integrity near new developments. The inspection took place quietly, without announcement. A man in plain clothes arrived one morning with a clipboard and a polite smile, introducing himself as Mr. Lyons from County Development. Karen met him at the gate, her charm in full display. Marissa watched from her porch, pretending to water the plants, as the two conversed. Lyons nodded and jotted notes while Karen gestured gracefully toward the half-finished pool, explaining its design with professional poise. But when he moved to take soil samples near the disputed edge, her expression shifted, barely, but enough for Marissa to see it. He left after 20 minutes, offering no comment. That evening, Karen's floodlights stayed off for the first time since the construction began. 3 days later, a notice arrived taped to both their mailboxes. It bore the county seal and the words, "Environmental review in progress. All site activity is to be suspended pending assessment." Marissa stood at her gate reading it as the late afternoon sun burned against her skin. Across the hedge, Karen appeared, holding her own copy of the notice. For the first time since this began, she didn't smile. Her voice when it came was quiet but sharp enough to cut air. "You've made a mistake," she said. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Marissa met her gaze without flinching. "Neither do you." The stalemate that followed felt electric. Work halted, the machinery stood idle, and the neighborhood began to whisper. Some sympathized with Karen, others avoided her altogether, but everyone knew something had shifted. Marissa went about her days quietly, keeping her head down, aware that the balance of power had tilted but not broken. Late at night, she sometimes caught glimpses of Karen pacing her patio, phone pressed to her ear, her movements tense and agitated. The air between their houses seemed charged, vibrating with unspoken threats. When the county inspectors returned for follow-up testing, Marissa stayed indoors, watching through the blinds as they walked the perimeter and took photographs. The silence afterward felt heavier than any argument. It was around this time that Marissa began to dream of the soil, thick, dark, and pulsing like a living thing beneath her feet. In the dreams, the earth seemed to breathe, exhaling quietly under the weight of concrete. She'd wake before dawn with her heart racing, the scent of wet dirt clinging to her memory. The pool site remained untouched, but its presence loomed over everything, a gaping wound that refused to close. And somewhere inside her, a realization took root. She was no longer merely defending property. She was defending the right to exist without being swallowed whole by someone else's certainty. The battle had outgrown boundaries and bylaws. It had become a test of endurance, one that would reveal who, in the end, truly belonged on that piece of earth. Karen did not disappear quietly. For a few weeks she seemed almost invisible, the kind of silence that was too precise to be mistaken for defeat. Then, like pressure building behind glass, her retaliation began to take form in small, deliberate gestures. One morning, Marissa found a letter from the HOA slipped under her door instead of in her mailbox. It accused her of property neglect and cited violations for unauthorized vegetation growth. The irony would have been laughable if it hadn't felt so calculated. Someone had filed complaints about her yard, the one that had been half destroyed by Karen's construction. A week later, she received another notice, this time demanding she remove hazardous debris from the boundary zone, referring to the same rebar and concrete fragments Karen's workers had left behind. Each letter was polite, bureaucratic, and venomous. She knew whose hand guided them. Karen had found a new weapon, procedure. Elias warned her to stay patient, to let the process run its course. "This is how people like her fight," he said. "They bury you in paper until you suffocate." But patience was wearing thin. The environmental review was still ongoing, its outcome pending, and Karen's influence within the HOA made every appeal feel like shouting into a void. The stress seeped into Marissa's days like dampness. She worked from home, but found it nearly impossible to concentrate. Every sound outside, the hum of a passing car, the thud of a gate closing, felt like another intrusion. At night, she'd walk through her house, switching off lights, checking locks twice, aware of the faint glow of Karen's porch lamps burning across the hedge. It wasn't paranoia if someone really was watching. Then, just as she began to think Karen might settle for bureaucratic warfare, a new escalation came, one that felt personal in a way the letters never could. On a windy afternoon in early October, Marissa returned from a meeting to find her garden gate open and her compost bins overturned. At first she assumed raccoons, but when she bent to right them, she saw the footprints, large, boot-shaped, pressed deep into the soil, leading straight from the hedge to the damaged bins. Her plants had been trampled, several potted ferns crushed underfoot. It wasn't vandalism born of impulse. It was a message. She photographed everything and sent it to Elias, who forwarded it to the HOA, though he warned her not to expect a response. He was right. The board acknowledged her email and advised both parties to maintain civility during the ongoing investigation. The neutrality of it felt obscene. Karen, meanwhile, had resumed her public performance. She started holding small evening gatherings again, inviting neighbors for wine tastings and poolside discussions, though the pool, still dry and unlined, remained a crater of halted ambition. From her window, Marissa could hear laughter drifting across the hedge, the clinking of glasses, Karen's voice rising above the others in bright, false cheer. Once, curiosity got the better of her. She stepped outside under the pretense of taking out trash, pausing where she could see the flicker of candles across the patio. Karen stood surrounded by her guests, radiant in white, telling a story about the ordeal with that new resident who doesn't understand our community's traditions. The group laughed politely. Marissa's throat tightened. She turned and went back inside, shutting the door before anyone saw her. The next morning, she found an anonymous envelope tucked between her front steps. Inside was a single printed photo. Her, standing by her own window, looking out. The image was grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. Beneath it, a handwritten note read, "You're not the only one who can take pictures." For the first time since the conflict began, fear outweighed anger. She called Elias immediately. His voice, though calm, held a tension she hadn't heard before. "Keep everything," he said. "Do not respond. Do not engage. We'll add this to the file. The county hearing is close, and this could work in our favor if it's presented correctly." Marissa wanted to believe him, but that night, when she turned off the lights and saw Karen's porch still glowing bright as ever, it didn't feel like progress. It felt like a stalemate she was slowly losing. Days passed, each one sharper than the last. Marissa began to notice how people averted their eyes when she passed them on her morning walks. Some avoided her altogether. The gossip had spread beyond control, and now she was the story, the troublemaker, the outsider, the woman who weaponized bureaucracy. It was almost poetic, the way Karen had reversed their roles. And yet beneath that surface calm, something in Karen's composure had begun to crack. She appeared thinner, her movements more clipped, her voice slightly brittle when she greeted people. Marissa saw her once shouting at a delivery driver, something she'd never witnessed before. The control that defined her was slipping, and with it came unpredictability. The final break arrived after a night of unrelenting rain. Marissa woke to the sound of rushing water, not from outside, but from beneath her kitchen floor. When she stepped onto the tile, a thin film of muddy water coated her feet. She ran outside and found that the runoff from Karen's construction site had flooded into her yard, collapsing part of the trench and sending a stream of sludge through the drainage line that connected to her foundation. Her mulch beds were ruined, her walkway submerged in brown water. She stood there, drenched and shaking, as the sun struggled to break through the storm clouds. Karen emerged moments later, wrapped in a raincoat, feigning surprise. "Oh, Marissa, how awful. I warned the contractor about grading issues, but they never listen. Don't worry, we'll have it cleaned up." Marissa laughed, an ugly, hollow sound. You did this, she said. You destroyed my property again. Karen's expression hardened. Watch your accusations, she said quietly. You're already in enough trouble with the association. Then she turned and walked back inside, leaving Marissa standing in the wreckage of her yard. When the inspector arrived 2 days later, summoned by Elias, he documented the damage in silence. It's not just runoff, he said, kneeling to examine the soil. There's chemical seepage here. Concrete mix, maybe. It's contaminated. He explained that Karen's project had likely violated multiple environmental protection statutes and that the county could now impose fines. For the first time in months, Marissa saw the faint outline of consequence forming around her neighbor's actions. Elias filed an emergency injunction, citing both environmental and property harm. The county responded within a week. Construction on the Melrose property was to be halted indefinitely pending further review. The order arrived like a stone dropped into still water. The noise of machinery ceased. The workers didn't return. The neighborhood grew unnervingly quiet. But Karen's silence wasn't surrender. Late at night, Marissa heard footsteps near the hedge, the faint scrape of something metallic against wood. Once she found her motion sensor light unscrewed, the bulb left shattered on the ground. Another time, a trail of chlorine powder appeared along the edge of her flower beds. The acts were small but pointed, reminders that the line between intimidation and madness was thinning. Elias urged her again to document everything, to remain steady, but there was a new weariness in his tone. This won't end until the ruling comes through, he said, and even then, it might not end cleanly. Marissa didn't answer. She was staring through her window at the still gray pit next door, water pooling at its bottom after the storm, reflecting the pale sky like an unblinking eye. The project that had started as a monument to Karen's control had turned into its opposite, a stagnant wound that mirrored her unraveling. And yet Marissa knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. People like Karen didn't retreat. They waited for the next opportunity to strike, even if it meant dragging everyone else into the ruin with them. The hearing took place in late November, inside a courthouse that smelled faintly of paper and cold metal. The sky outside was pale, the kind of washed-out gray that made the day feel suspended between seasons. Marissa sat at the long wooden table beside Elias, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while across from them, Karen Melrose adjusted the cuffs of her blazer and smiled at the clerk as though attending a charity luncheon. Even here, surrounded by the rigid formality of law, Karen radiated control. Her posture was flawless, her hair immaculate, her voice smooth when she greeted the judge. For a moment, Marissa wondered if the woman had rehearsed it all in front of her mirror. The tone, the pauses, the performance of reason. But beneath the veneer of composure, there was something sharp in her movements, a stiffness that betrayed the strain of months spent watching her empire of influence crack. The county had combined the property and environmental complaints into a single hearing, which meant the stakes were higher than either woman had anticipated. The gallery behind them was filled with curious neighbors and a few reporters from local outlets, drawn by whispers of a scandal involving a prominent community leader. Marissa tried not to look at them. She kept her focus on the judge, a middle-aged woman with silver streaks in her hair and a face that had forgotten how to soften. When the session began, the rhythm of legal language filled the room. Citations, measurements, exhibits, references to bylaws and maps. Elias spoke first, methodically outlining the evidence, the survey confirming the encroachment, the environmental reports detailing the chemical runoff, the photographs of contamination. Each piece was presented without drama, only precision, and that made it more devastating. Karen's attorney, a tall man with the easy arrogance of corporate defense, countered with practiced deflection. He argued that any boundary overlap was the result of innocent clerical error, that the environmental damage was unsubstantiated, and that Mrs. Melrose had acted in good faith to improve community aesthetics. It was the phrase good faith that made Marissa's stomach tighten. She'd heard those words before, during mediation, repeated like a charm meant to erase consequence. When Karen finally spoke for herself, her voice carried a trace of exhaustion, but also an edge of bitterness. "I've lived in Sycamore Glen for more than 10 years," she began. "In that time, I've done everything I could to make it better. Organizing events, maintaining standards, keeping our property values strong. This entire matter could have been avoided if certain people had been willing to cooperate instead of escalating private misunderstandings into public theater." Her gaze slid toward Marissa, calm and poisonous. "I've been vilified for simply trying to protect what's mine." Elias stood slowly. "What's hers," he said, "extends beyond her own land. That's the problem." He handed the judge a series of photographs: the flooded garden, the contaminated soil, the construction map showing the overlap in bold red lines. "These aren't misunderstandings. They're choices." His tone was quiet, deliberate. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the ventilation. The judge studied the documents, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her words cut through the stillness. "Mrs. Melrose, did you receive approval from the county to conduct excavation within a restricted soil zone?" Karen hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Her attorney tried to interject, but the judge raised a hand. "Yes or no?" Karen swallowed. "I was told the permits were sufficient." "By whom?" the judge pressed. "The contractor," Karen said, her voice tight. "And the HOA approved it." That was the turning point. Elias leaned forward slightly, his voice gaining weight. "The HOA, which Mrs. Melrose herself represented on the landscaping committee, issued an informal approval for her own project, in violation of multiple conflict of interest clauses. She not only authorized the encroachment, but used her position to suppress the complaint once it was filed. The environmental review wasn't initiated until my client independently contacted the county." The judge's gaze flicked back to Karen, who sat motionless, her fingers clasped so tightly that her knuckles whitened. The courtroom, which had felt comfortably neutral minutes earlier, now seemed to tilt against her. When the ruling came, it landed like a single heavy note in a quiet symphony. The judge declared the construction illegal and ordered full removal of the pool foundation within 30 days. Karen was to fund the restoration of Marissa's property and pay restitution for environmental damage totaling nearly $2 million, part of which would cover soil rehabilitation and Marissa's legal costs. But the punishment extended beyond money. The county referred the case to the state's ethics board for investigation into HOA misconduct, and Karen was barred from holding any administrative position within the community pending the outcome. The sentence was read in a tone devoid of malice. Simply fact, absolute and final. Karen didn't move when it ended. The color had drained from her face, leaving her skin pale and almost translucent under the courtroom lights. For the first time, she looked small. Not broken, not destroyed, just diminished, like a figure carved from air whose edges had been made visible. Marissa sat still as well, not triumphant, not even relieved. There was no pleasure in seeing the inevitable unfold, only a quiet recognition that something vast and poisonous had finally been exposed to daylight. Outside the courthouse, the wind had picked up, cold and dry. A few reporters called out questions, but Marissa ignored them. She could see Karen standing near the steps, surrounded by her attorney and a handful of loyal neighbors, her expression distant, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. As Marissa passed, Karen turned her head slightly, and their eyes met for the briefest instant. There was no fury there anymore, only disbelief, the look of someone who had lived too long inside her own version of truth and had just watched it collapse. Marissa walked past without a word. The sound of her heels against the stone steps echoed in the cold air, steady and unhurried. The rhythm of a battle finally ended, not with victory, but with exhaustion and the quiet relief of survival. Winter settled over Sycamore Glen like a slow exhale, softening the sharp edges of everything that had been broken. The noise of construction, the hum of gossip, the echo of arguments, all of it faded beneath the muffled quiet of cold mornings and pale skies. Marissa no longer woke to the metallic shriek of machinery or the glare of floodlights through her windows. Instead, there was the rhythm of wind moving through bare branches, the distant sound of children playing, and the creak of her porch as frost began to lace its edges. The pit next door was gone. The pool had been dismantled piece by piece, the heavy equipment carted away under county supervision, leaving behind a raw, uneven patch of earth covered with straw and erosion netting. Karen's house stood silent now, its windows dark, the for sale sign planted in her perfect lawn like a quiet confession. No one waved from that porch anymore. No one came to visit. Marissa spent the first weeks after the ruling in a strange state of calm that bordered on disbelief. She tended her garden as though caring for a wound, cutting away what had been crushed, turning the soil, planting winter ivy along the boundary where the fence would soon be rebuilt. The ground still smelled faintly of cement and rain, but life had already begun to return in small, stubborn ways. Tiny shoots pushing through the earth, threads of green defying the months of damage. Neighbors, once distant or complicit, began to approach her again, awkward at first, offering quiet apologies masked as casual conversation. Some brought plants, others baked goods, as if trying to cover the silence that had stretched too long. Marissa accepted their gestures without resentment. She had learned that forgiveness wasn't for the person who caused the harm. It was a way of freeing herself from the gravity of it. When the new fence was finally installed, she chose cedar instead of metal, tall enough to mark a boundary but not so high that it cast a shadow. On the last day of the work, she stood watching the light fall across the posts, a slow gradient of gold over wood, and realized that the sound she'd been waiting for wasn't silence at all, but stillness, the absence of tension, of someone else's will pressing against her own. That evening she brewed tea, wrapped herself in a blanket, and sat on the porch. Across the street, the houses glowed with their early holiday lights. For the first time since moving here, the place looked almost beautiful again, imperfect and alive. She thought of Karen only once more, weeks later, when a moving truck pulled away from the Melrose house and the wind lifted a fragment of blue tarp that had been left behind, catching it on the corner of the fence. It fluttered there for a long moment before the gust tore it free, sending it tumbling down the street until it vanished behind the trees. Marissa watched it go, neither sad nor triumphant, only aware of the quiet space it left behind. She turned back toward her garden, where the soil had begun to settle, and new shoots had taken root, their green brighter than she remembered. The land no longer felt contested. It felt earned. And in that simple, unremarkable peace, she understood that what she had fought for had never really been ownership. It had been the right to draw a line and keep it, to say this is mine, and it will remain mine, not out of pride, but because every boundary deserves to hold.